TC is very, very excited. And so let's use the next 2 days to really make sure you get the information you need so you can take this back, fan out, and move us forward into the next year. Thanks very much.
All right, everybody, if you all saw the blue folder sitting on the desks here, inside there is a bio on Richard Thieme, and I'm going to read a little bit out of here just because it's an interesting thing. But for 8 years, Richard has spoken for the Black Hat Briefings and DEF CON, the annual Hackers Convention. At DEF CON 2000, he moderated a panel that included the Assistant Secretary of Defense and others who came to dialogue with 5,000 computer hackers. He was invited to moderate because, according to the National Security Agency veteran, you're the only one in the room accepted and respected by both hackers and feds. And I think that's an interesting introduction after the comments we've all seen with the virus in the world that's impacting us in the future. Richard, you want to come up and take it for the workplace of the future?
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'm going to try to do is stretch your thinking a little bit in the directions you've already heard outlined toward some of the possibilities that are emerging in the future. Just try to take it in. This is not a note-taking session. You've got a videotape if you miss something, because what I'm going to be talking about is the context as the content, the context of IT and the context of the world that's emerging. But first, and this was not scripted until a day or two ago, I want to make it personal. You don't usually make IT personal. That's what IT is about, right? Not being personal. But what you do is very, very personal, and I want to tell you why. Last Sunday, I got one of those telephone calls from hell that said my son on his motorcycle had hit the back of a pickup truck at 70 miles an hour on the coast road in California and flew into the pavement at slightly less than 70 miles an hour, and he had just been flown by a helicopter to the Memorial Medical Center in Modesto, California, and they were currently doing scans and would let me know if he was going to live. They did surgery that night to repair his torn aorta, 85% mortality. The doctor said most people don't leave the scene of the accident, most don't leave the helicopter, and if they get to surgery, they don't leave surgery. His liver was bleeding. His leg was badly broken in many places. His ribs are broken. He has a crack on his back. And when I went into the ICU when I got to California, you could barely distinguish a human being among all the medical technology. You know what it's like in there. There was one slow, swollen, pink hand reaching out from all the tubes, the monitors, and the contracting cuffs in order to take my hand. I was hoping I could get through this. This is what you do. You saved my son's life. 1% shot, the doctor said. No brain damage, no spinal damage. He's irritated at the food. A week later, which is truly miraculous. So that is the context in which I want to speak to you out of perhaps the deepest and the clearest and the most profound awareness of what it is you do by creating a world in which I can walk in to, in effect, a cyborg. My son hooked up, implanted, connected, lights, tubes, monitors. This is the cyborg reality that we have created. And ultimately, I think we'll get to a point in this talk where I will be able to say, and you'll know what I mean by it, that there is really no distinction between information technology and medical technology. Because what we're talking about is learning to live inside a complex system in which energy and information move at the speed of light. The threat are the viruses and the attacks. The upside is the extraordinary level of complexity, which is requiring you to go to the next level, as Jeff just outlined it is necessary for you to do. When he talked about centerpiece and what it is going to ask of you, let me put this in context. This is merely one example of how the boundaries around everybody, individuals, organizations, geopolitical structures, non-state entities like terrorists, NCOs, and the like, are morphing or transforming our very identity. I want to take it up to that level. IT is not merely about granular engineering. I did a talk once for Astronomical Society in the suburbs of Chicago. And actually, it was on UFO phenomena, what it is and what it might not be. And I asked what the audience was going to consist of. And they said, well, these are all engineers and astronomers. I said, oh, yeah, it's a highly educated audience then. I can go out pretty far to the edges. And they said, well, yeah, they're educated, but they're engineers. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. I'm just telling you what the engineer said. I didn't say it. What's required, as Jeff pointed out, is that engineering be integrated with communication skills and business acumen for a very good reason. Just think about it. What is IT? And what is information technology? It's the way the human cyborg, the mind-machine combination that we have created, the symbiotic relationship we have engendered, thinks. Marvin Minsky said this a long time ago at MIT. He said, well, what is it to think? Let's think about thinking for a minute, he said. Thinking is the ability to hold simultaneously in your mind a multiplicity of representations of reality, none of which are, of course, exactly true, but you are searching in the process of holding them there for a map of reality that's good enough for now. The map is not the territory, but the map is a good enough template which you can use to then maneuver or navigate yourself through the territory. And you have to be able to hold contradictory and multiple representations in your mind at the same time. This is what we mean by thinking. And where is thinking taking place, he said today, in the early days of the nascent network? He said thinking is taking place on the network itself, into which increasingly all human beings are of necessity plugged in. And the converse is true, too, he said. If someone can only hold one image of reality in their mind at one time, then we could say that they are not really capable of thinking. I think most of us have at least one person like that in our families, don't we? I mean, they just know one thing. They are literally fundamentalists about that one thing. And your option is to approach them or leave them on the dialogue, but they don't move. They can't flex. They can't negotiate. They literally can't think. And Minsky made the point that people who are not plugged into the network and capable of functioning in a networked way, which demands new behaviors and new patterns of thinking of you, are going to be about as useless to society in the next century, i.e. this one, as a desktop computer on a corner table pushed over into some shadows in the meeting room. They're going to be about as valuable, he said, as a brain in a bottle. So the network that we're talking about is a symbiotic relationship which is constantly morphing and constantly demanding that we change with it, and that is the challenge. The network is about the people who are fused with the network. When I walked into ICU, believe me, I was deeply aware and grateful for the technology that sustained and saved my son's life. But it was there because there was a soul in the machine, and that human soul and that beating heart that you began long ago to help keep beating is what it's about. So this is why you have to constantly allow yourself to be challenged to move into that space where change is possible. The future is going to demand a lot of change of us. I love hearing myself called a futurist. I am not a futurist. I don't have a clue what I'm going to have for lunch today, much less what's coming in the weeks and years and centuries ahead. What I try to do is describe the present to the degree that I can get my mind around it. But there are a lot of people who have not yet arrived at the present, and that's why I will sound to them like a futurist. Because if you live in the past, the present is the future. All right. So thank you for getting it at this early hour of the morning. All right, so what's in the way? What's in the way? Our human nature is in the way, and that's part of what we have to deal with. He talked about SAP. I love SAP. Taking on a system-wide enterprise software complex like SAP is like two companies merging. And when I've seen two companies merge and the cultures clash, it's really pretty critical. because it challenges people to change their behavior. And people feel almost lost and abandoned, like children alone in the night, unloved because they don't know where their place is in the new network that's reconfiguring itself on the fly, and you're not sure where you belong, and mergers are very challenging. Well, taking on something like SAP at an enterprise-wide level is very similar to merging, with this difference. When you merge, it's all humans, and there's some give and take between the cultures. But when you implement a software system enterprise-wide, the software system asks of you radical new behaviors, radical new ways of thinking. That's why programming the system is, in fact, programming the people who are going to be forced to use the system, because either they comply with what the network requires of them in the software that programs it, or they're not able to function anymore, and they're back being a brain in a bottle, as Minsky said. They have to have the capacity to morph. Everybody knows what morph means, I trust, right? Who knows what morph means? Just do a little test. All right, most people. In the old days, you'd get 1 out of 100, maybe. That was before Terminator. Terminator 2. Everybody seen Terminator 2? Of course. Morphing is what that quicksilver metal guy from the future, the Terminator, did when he ran to the door, you know, and there'd be a door, and he'd bounce off it, and suddenly he'd dissolve into a quicksilver puddle and ooze under the door and come back into form, except instead of a hand, he had a shining steel sword with a bright tip, and you're on the edge of your seat screaming, "Run, Arnold, run!" Right? Well, that's morphing. It's going from one state to the next state in incremental states, each of which is connected sufficiently to the one before and to the one after for you to be able to manage it incrementally, as opposed to a complete transformation. So morphing means you start out as grandmother, and then your grandmother with maybe a grayer face, and then your grandmother with a grayer face and long gray hair, and then your grandmother with grayer face and long gray hair and sharp, pointy teeth, and then you're a wolf. That's morphing. You're not grandmother, wolf. Grandmother, wolf. Okay, everybody seen Terminator 2, right? Not everybody. What do you read books at night? I mean, this is classic formative archetypal stuff, Terminator. So the challenge is, how do you morph from one state to the other? How do you build the structures that provide the internal as well as external security that enables you to move from one state to another in response to the demands? I mentioned boundaries. Boundaries are what is transformed by technology. Identity is what is transformed by technology. I'll give you a quick example. When the printing press was invented, 1450s, William Caxton brought it to England. And when he looked back, 1470s is when he brought it. And when he looked back as a man in his 60s at the landscape of his youth, he said, "I cannot recognize how it was when I was a young man. Everything has changed so radically since then." And he wasn't talking about the landscape out there in Yorkshire or East Anglia. He was talking about the landscape inside human beings. Because to bring the new technology of the word into a culture meant they had to choose a dialect. And once they chose a dialect that was going to imprint itself on the consciousness of everybody around them, they were going to transform the consciousness of those people from East Anglians or Northumberlandians or Yorkshiremen or whatever they were to Englishmen. The word Englishman didn't exist until the Renaissance, the Reformation. All of the post-printing press technological consequences in society and political structure. What else is a boundary? What else is a nation state but a boundary around a higher level of complexity, economic, social, and political, which is required by the increased level of speed and abstraction of the data that is flowing? In other words, the printing press itself engendered a transformation of civilization, which required the boundaries which had been adequately around smaller units to morph, to transform themselves into larger units. And that's the context in which I heard Jeff speaking today. When he talked about the need to take it to the next level, he was saying the boundary that we drew around the level of organizational complexity and abstraction that was here in the past is no longer adequate to the future, and it is, of course, changing faster and faster and faster. So that is why it is imperative upon every organizational structure to constantly reinvent itself in order to deal adequately with the level of complexity which IT is the engine The transformative engine, what it is creating in society, is a new level. This is why boundaries are going down. This is why nation states are in such flux. This is why when I work with the intelligence community and the hackers, and they're indistinguishable by the way, it's a question not of behavior, but of allegiance, which is what I said to the hackers at the first conference when I spoke to them. My talk was called Hacking as Practice for Transplanetary Culture in the 21st Century. And since then, 9 years ago, there have been 3 generations of hackers, and a lot of the boys have grown up and worked for In-Q-Tel, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, because I could say to them, it's not your behaviors that are a problem. You can hack your hearts out. You can break into anything you want. Just come over to the protected side and do it undercover, where whatever you do illegally is sanctioned. And you will be rewarded for it. And you will have the best tools in the world with which to play. Right? And that's exactly what they did. So what does that say about the challenge facing you? It says that competitive intelligence is suddenly everywhere a challenge as a consequence of the technology. What used to be sanctioned by the nation state for spies, for the intelligence world, is now sanctioned for everyone by virtue of the technology itself. It gives people in a world without walls the ability to put on Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility, as a hacker said to me the other day, and walk through walls and get the power rush of I can see, I can hear, I can be there, and they can't see me. And believe me, they can go anywhere they want if they can manage their egos and discipline themselves to get in and get out quickly, cover their tracks, and be stealthy and not self-aggrandizing. Then you can do the job. And if you're listening, that's the definition of a spy. Well, I'm throwing that in to say this is an example of how something that was determined by a level of technology in the past has morphed through the technology of network-centric warfare and life, so that it is now given to the young people. That's why I went to them, so the young people could teach me on the edges of things how things were going to evolve. So what's in the way? What's in the way? I think it's human nature, but the best example of it I know comes from a scientist friend of mine who did an experiment with rats, big, fat, white laboratory rats. He built a compound that had 4 tubes in it. 1, 2, 3, 4. He took a piece of Wisconsin cheddar cheese and he put it at the end of tube 2. And then he took the rat and he put it in the compound with the tubes and observed its behavior. And the rat sniffed the first tube, nothing. Smart rat went on the second tube, sniffed, cheese, down the tube, ate the cheese, came out, put him back in his cage. End of day 1. Every day he put the cheese in tube 2, the rat into the compound. Every day the rat went down tube 2, ate the cheese, went back home, fat and sassy, until the rat had been thoroughly conditioned or socialized or habituated to going down tube 2 and getting the cheese. Then the scientist, being a human being, i.e. being capricious, arbitrary, and quite cruel, did not put any cheese in the compound at all. He didn't move the cheese. That book had already been written, right? Next one will be, who stole my cheese? And as my publishing friends tell me, it should be no bigger than this. It should have lots of white space, very little text, as little meaning as possible, and put it on the counter at Barnes & Noble, and you become a guest on Oprah and Dr. Phil. It's just a certain little trajectory. So he took the cheese entirely out of the compound, put the rat in, and the rat did what? Well, the rat went to tube 2, down the tube, no cheese, came out. You could see its little rat whiskers twitch, little rat brain hum as it thought over the problem. Call it a committee meeting, if you will, trying to solve this dilemma. Back down tube 2. No cheese again, back out, back down, back out, back down. Finally, the scientist had the data he needed to come to a sane, reasonable conclusion about the difference between rats and human beings. And do you know what the primary or essential difference between rats and humans is? Eventually, the rat will stop. Eventually, the rat will stop. All right, end of story. The point being that we do become habituated, we become trained by the IT system you have yourselves built and implemented in a symbiotic relationship with it as described years ago by Marvin Minsky, which determines your thought patterns and your ways of thinking. It describes your parameters. It describes the boundaries. It describes what you hold as possible for action. That's why you cannot overestimate how important it is to keep in mind the big picture of what you're doing, as well as the granular nature. When I said that joking toss-away line about engineers, it's just simply a warning saying if you only stay granular and miss the big picture, you're not going to see the purpose for which the technology is being built, the human being who is the user. And you have to see the purpose for which it's built. A friend of mine, an engineer, had a daughter who came to him and said, "Daddy, I want a tree house." He was thrilled to be given a task by his daughter that he could do. It was great. So he went to work, went to Home Depot or wherever you go, and got all this stuff and built the most beautiful, designed it and architected it, and found the spot in the tree and built the tree house and built the ladder and watched with joy as she went up with her friends to play and came down, and they never went up to it again. Never went in again. Well, he's feeling pretty badly, and he said, "What's wrong with the tree house?" She said, "Oh, it's just so hard to get our toys up there." In other words, he was an engineer. He had an engineering problem that he had to solve, build the best treehouse from the point of view of architecture. He didn't ask the human user what the purpose of the treehouse was going to be. What she wanted to do was take her friends and all their toys up in the treehouse and play. And by building it 30 feet up and needing to go up a rope ladder to get in it, he made it impossible for them to use. So the task, which it is easy for us to do from an IT point of view, is not easy to do from a human point of view, which is what is the purpose for which the data that is being demanded by everyone as you restructure and rethink yourselves, what is the ultimate purpose for which it is going to be used? If you did not start with the end, you're not going to be able to reason back to building the structure that delivers it in the first place, and then you will have people calling the help desk all the time saying, "I can't get the information I need." Obviously, the question first to ask is, what is the information that the human being needs? And because we are morphing, even as we build the platform as I speak, that is a moving target. It is always on its way to being something else, and that's why what has been asked of people, it's why most people in this room are younger than I am, is a flexibility, an elasticity, a responsiveness to fast-changing conditions that makes it difficult for some people to cope because they have been imprinted with the cheese being at the end of tube 2. All of us are in this boat. It's about patterns. It's about forming patterns too quickly. I work a lot in security, and I've asked a lot of the smartest people I know at NSA and in corporate and CIA for their macro insights, their heuristics, if you will, that makes them experts, how it is that they think about security issues. Because security is merely the control mechanism of IT. And therefore, if you go there first, you see what the society is going to bring forth a little further on. I'll talk about that in a minute. How you go to the right edges to see what's emerging in IT. And one of the people I know worked at CIA, very smart person. You remember a few years ago, a gentleman from Pakistan shot dead some people in front of CIA and made good his escape. He was subsequently apprehended, brought back over here, and recently was executed. She was one of the people who profiled him, who tracked him, and she was there when they cuffed him and nailed him and brought him back. In exchange for this great service to our nation, she was given a plaque, which is immediately burned. Right? You're invited to the office of the director and say, "Thank you for your good work. It didn't happen. Goodbye." And you have to live with that level of secrecy and self-knowledge that enables you to keep going. In fact, she's now said the plaque has been declassified, so she can say that she got the plaque and what she got it for. But none of the details of that case are available because they've been sealed. So what I was talking to her about was how she did her profiling, because she's known as an expert profiler. And she said the mistake people always make is they let their minds come to a conclusion too quickly. They let a pattern form too quickly. They think they know. They think they know. Take the snipers in Washington as an example. What were we looking for? A couple of white guys in a pickup truck, a white truck, right? Even when they're writing notes with rap lyrics in it, they're looking for a couple of white guys in a white truck. In other words, she said, they did not allow the data to speak to them, and that is the task that challenges you. When we think we know, we get into trouble. Because most of the time we don't know, but we don't know that we don't know. And so the real challenge is to become aware that we don't know and know that we don't know. To move from a level of unconscious incompetence to a level of conscious incompetence. Because at that level, and I'm not saying something demeaning, I'm talking about the human condition for all of us, especially under conditions of radical change. That is the human condition. Then we are teachable. Then we are open. Then we are capable of being integrated as nodes into a network, which is what is necessary in order to do the work which the network in turn has created for us. It is a new kind of human. Power is exercised differently in a network. In a top-down world, power is exercised by dominating and controlling others. But try to control a network from your node, and you can't do it. The energy diffuses throughout the web. It dissipates over time. You don't even know where it goes, and you try to make it move, and it's like trying to make the ocean move. You can't do it. Power in a network or web is exercised by contributing and participating. Contributing and participating. And it is exercised by knowing how to be a node in a network, a self-conscious node connected to, cooperatively, other people. I did some work once, years ago, for a Northern Illinois school district. They fed people to Abbott Labs and to Motorola. And they periodically asked those corporations to give them feedback about how the school was doing and turning out the kind of people that they needed for the work. And they said they were doing a pretty good job in almost everything except being part of cooperative work teams. They didn't do that so well. And when they asked for a definition, and I said, what do you mean by being part of a cooperative work team? And they described it to me. I said, my heavens, do you know what they called that 20 years ago when I was in school? They called it cheating. They called it cheating. Because I was taught to be a brain in a bottle. I was taught to be a standalone node, not a node, standalone unit. I was taught not to look at Bruce Rockwell's paper during my physics exam. In fact, I was a pioneer in cooperative learning in that physics course. And we developed all sorts of ad hoc ways of communicating as a network. But do you think I was honored and acknowledged for being a futurist and a leader? Looking forward, no. I was sent to room 127 and usually punished when they would catch me. But it is true that if you just did your work alone, you were doing the right thing. And 20 years later, if you're doing your work alone, you don't know how to function in a work team. It's just a trivial example of how the network has transformed humanity into a new kind of being with a different kind of identity that needs a different kind of set of skills. And the teachers couldn't teach it because they didn't know it. And when you don't know something, what do? You do what you know how to do. You go down tube 2 and eat the cheese, even if it's not there. And even though you're losing weight, you tell yourself you had a great meal and it was very nourishing and it was delicious, and you compare flavors and scents of cheese with the other people who also pretend they are eating the cheese, and therefore you get agreement, and pretty soon you got a society that is in denial, but it's happily in denial. But the real task is to recognize when you don't know that you don't know, and then work cooperatively. The teachers had built, think about it. What was school when I was a child? It was a top-down hierarchical structure in which a person was taught to deliver a curriculum as the curriculum demanded in a highly controlled way, day by day by day, lesson plan by lesson plan, which is why when I went to the hackers first, they would tell me stories like this. One hacker said, I was asked to help the guy set up the computer lab in our school. And I tried to do that by just giving him as much as he needed to know when he would come to me with a question. I would just give him what he needed to know so that if he had a clue, he could see what he needed to do next and anticipate the next problems that were going to arrive. But he couldn't do that. You see, he couldn't think out of the box. So I just told him as much as he needed to know to not get into trouble. That's the 16-year-old training the leader of the computer workshop, the teacher. And the same kid said to me, I just can't wait every day to get out of school so I can go home and start learning. Okay, now, obviously today, the next generation, a generation 3, 4, 5 years, has been so thoroughly socialized to the networked way of learning that it doesn't even think about its assumptions anymore. Like the freshmen at Harvard a couple of years ago who were part of a focus group and asked where they went for want ads. Where do you read want ads? And they listed all the places they go. I go to this website and that one. Finally, the questioner said, do any of you ever go to a newspaper? And they just kind of looked at each other. Like, what? It just wasn't part of their experience anymore. To open a newspaper to go look for a want ad when you just go click? Duh. And that's how quickly the transformation of identity and socialization had taken place. And therefore, what I'm asking you to do is to please watch your mind, watch your behaviors. What my friend Terry from CIA said it requires is intense concentration and constant self-monitoring. You must know what you know and observe yourself knowing, thinking, and behaving in order to know when you're not plugging the right behaviors or thought patterns into what is demanded. You have to learn how to unlearn, in other words. You have to learn how to unlearn, like the professor who went to the Zen master, and he said, I want to learn from you. And the Zen master intuitively sized him up and said, will you please get me some tea? And he brought him the tea, and he poured it into his cup, and the cup filled up, and then he kept pouring, and it overflowed. And he said, stop, the cup is full. And the Zen master said, and so are you. And if you want to learn anything from me, you must first empty your cup. Well, my observation working with people on the frontiers of knowledge is that they are constantly emptying their cups. Because however short a time it has been, you have been here part of a culture. You know how cultures work. You are socialized into it. This is a wonderful culture. I'm coming here full of gratitude and appreciation for what you do. But it's a culture. And as soon as you get into a culture, it socializes, integrates you, and tames you. You know, as a consultant sometimes, I notice, you know, we're like cucumbers, and we jump into the brine, and we expect to cucumber the brine, right? But we always get pickled. Why? Because it doesn't take long before the unconscious assumptions of the culture and its rewards and values begin to permeate and become internalized in our lives. That's why Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said she needs a whole year to learn again as much as she learned in 1 week by going into that new culture, because you become that rapidly assimilated into it. And therefore, you need a point of view, a meta point of view, a transcendent point of view that is constantly challenging your point of view, even inside this complex culture. And it's upsides and downsides. Jeff said, we're not going to outsource like, you know, parentheses, like GE Medical Systems does, close parentheses, where I just did some work. But that means we're going to keep it as much as possible with a boundary around it, and the boundary is called Medtronic. And what I'm saying about boundaries and identities is that they leak information. It's why competitive intelligence is so much in the forefront now. It's the forefront of all state intelligence. So what Terry taught me was, don't form a pattern too quickly. Do not form a pattern too quickly. Observe yourself in the process of forming a pattern. Ask yourself, is it really true what I'm thinking? Is this the best way to do it? In other words, these are tools for dealing with what's coming. I can't tell you what's coming because I don't know, but I can tell you that what's coming is going to be challenging the same way that rat was challenged. Look for what doesn't fit the pattern. Always a hacker in a system leaves data, leaves tracks, leaves some clue that if you follow it. How did they catch the Unabomber? Because as much as an isolated being as he tried to be, he was a social being who had a brother and who had a need to publish, and that's how they nailed him. If you speak to other people, if you move, you can be nailed and you can be tracked. It's the essence of our counterterrorism right now. That's why we're headed rapidly toward a total surveillance society. Because if you know to whom everybody is speaking and where everybody is going and how they get there and how their money moves, which is the dye in the artery of terrorism and everything else, then you can track people's movements and determine what collective groups they are forming on the fly, those ad hoc identities. So you get an idea that IT is not just, it's not just tools. It's not just wires. It's not just wireless. It's transforming us deeply and profoundly. And this is what a friend of mine at NSA said. He said, nobody's asking the right questions. He said, these are the questions. How do you live vibrantly? How do you free your mind? How do you live in a world without walls? That's how he defined the problem. The machine, said Marshall McLuhan, easily masters the grim and the dumb. The masters of technology must be lighthearted and intelligent. And that's what is asked of you. So there are no simplistic answers. I always love it when I finish the first 2 of 27 pages and I've got 20 minutes to go. There are no simplistic answers to these complex questions, but there are things we can do that make it most likely to succeed. One of them is in the environment I've described, in which Jeff described to you, that's coming more and more in spades. You know, what kind of ideas should you be looking for that are going to help you do your work? What is IT going to produce for you on the edges? Somebody asked Robert Galvin that. Robert Galvin built Motorola into the great corporation that it became. And he did it by having a lot of strange ideas meetings in which nothing was excluded. Anybody could suggest anything, things that sounded preposterous then. Only a few years ago, do you know the idea of a chip in your head sounded preposterous? What is a pacemaker? But just a big chip in your body. And as the chips get smaller and smaller and they get put in your head, and they enhance your cognition and your memory. Don't you see Blade Runner? Do you know that movie? Terminator I can understand, but Blade Runner, everybody has to see Blade Runner because it raises fundamental issues of identity, really critical. The critical question in Blade Runner when the cop was trying to track the replicant, but the replicant didn't know it was a replicant because it was such a well-built human being. And he said, how can it not know what it is? That was the philosophical question of that movie. But at the end, it became clear, kind of, that he was probably a replicant too. And he didn't know it. And the way replicants supported their identity was through a series of photographs. Think about it. A photograph is an objectification, a technology that allows you to objectify your memory and look at it to prop up your sense of self, your boundary around who you are and who you think you are. And in the movie, the memories, the photographs, were manufactured. Well, we live in a world in which our memories are manufactured. Just last week, 69% of your fellow countrymen and countrywomen said they believe Saddam Hussein was complicitous in 9/11. 69%. The evidence is that he was not. The statements are that he is not. But the job has been so well done. How do you manage memories? People think they remember what they were told was true. And right now, you know that we live in a vast machinery that is cranking out images and ideas designed to support certain kinds of identities and therefore points of view. That's at the macro level. At the micro level, it's done through implants, it's done through chemicals, it's done through medical devices. So a pacemaker, does that change a human being and make them not a human being? How about if you add artificial limbs? Does that do it? How about if you put a cochlear implant in at the same time? How about if you use some of these new optical devices that bypass the brain and give fields of optical stimulation to somebody through glasses that they wear here and it plugs directly into the brain? At what point do you ask of the being you have transformed, how can it not know what it is when it is more machine than human? Where is the soul in the machine? Those are the big questions that every day confront you, in which it is probably your blessing and your curse that you set aside in order to do your work. Well, I was talking about Robert Galvin, wasn't I, before I got off on that. Robert Galvin was asked at the end of his career, how did he spot those breakthrough ideas that made such a critical difference in his life? He said, well, you know, when I think about it, every idea that turned out to be a really breakthrough idea in technology was voiced at first by a single person. It was a minority opinion, and no one, when it was said, even heard it. Now, you know that the ideas migrate from the edges to the center and form a consensus for themselves. Let me give you an example, trivial. How many of you believe women should be paid significantly less, I would say 50% less, for doing exactly the same work as the men beside them? Would you please raise your hands, go on record? Okay, there's always one, right? Always one. Okay, all right? It's great to be a silverback. I know you don't believe me, but it's great to be old and to remember that when Gloria Steinem in the 60s first voiced that radical notion, nobody thought she was serious. When she first said that women should be paid the same as men, no one heard it as a serious suggestion. When she said it again, people laughed. When she said it again and started a magazine to promulgate the idea and the philosophy, which it was a core piece, they laughed, but now they laughed with derision. They laughed with an edge. And as she kept coming, they kept fighting back. And you go back and look at the character assassination, the things they said about her as they tried to destroy her and her whole program of radical, revolutionary ideas that are going to destroy the America we know and love. And then you finally arrive at the place that looks like consensus reality, which is what you just experienced here, when everybody not only knows it's a good idea, they always thought it was a good idea all along. That's how these ideas migrate from the edge to the center. And Galvin said, you know, the corollary was always true too. When you were getting in meetings deciding what was the best thing to do next, he said, whenever someone suggested an idea and everybody immediately agreed that it was the right thing to do, it was always wrong. He didn't say sometimes wrong. He said always wrong. Now, if you think about what I'm saying in relationship to IT, what you just get is that there's this vast, complex machinery out there through which information is moving. And new notions, new insights, new ways of being appropriate to new conditions are going to show up first on what feels like, to our human condition, the edges of things. And then over time, they will migrate. And this is really, in a way, the same thing my friend Terry was saying from CIA. Do not allow the patterns that have already been formed in the past to control you, to constrain you. Do not be constrained by what you have done, because what you have done is over. The present is the future, i.e., I am describing what is coming as it comes over the edge. And therefore, I think I'm saying what George Bernard Shaw said a long time ago, all great truth begins as blasphemy. You must build into your thinking, in small groups as well as large, an openness to heresy, even the heresies that confront the most cherished and beloved truths that you think are true, which were true in the context in which they first emerged and are not true any longer. So you have a difficult job. How do you distinguish what is genuinely crazy from what only sounds crazy? You know, because someone sooner or later says, does that mean everything that sounds crazy is a great idea? No, it means everything that's a great idea sounds crazy. It's not the same subset. So you know the record on what people have thought were crazy. Ross Perot at EDS said in 1980 about Microsoft, when someone suggested they buy it, what do 13 people in Seattle know that we don't know? Right? When Gutenberg first began printing, less than 2% of the population of Europe could read, and Edison was told that people would never wire their houses to install the kinds of lights he was invented. Ford was told not to mass produce automobiles because there were no roads. You have to aim the rocket where the moon is going to be, not where the moon is now. And this is a quote I pulled from Aviation Weekly, place I like to go. Air Force Secretary Roche, I still have a memo from those who said Predator, the UCAV, the unmanned aerial vehicle, wasn't ready for production, was too risky to use, unsuitable for war. In the same magazine, they had an article on how the Pentagon is quadrupling the UAV force by 2010 because now they are in great demand in every theater. Every time a new, innovative way of doing technology emerges, it genuinely sounds crazy. It's why Western Union missed the telephone. It's why Kodak totally missed the Xerox machine. And it's why IBM in the 70s missed the concept of the personal computer. You know, the history of the telephone is a very good example of this, and it illustrates how technology socializes and transforms us so we can take those lessons and be aware or alert to what's coming on the edges. A friend of mine not long ago said to me at the end of a conversation, I want to talk more, but I've got to go. Please do me a favor, call me, but don't send me an email, she said. I want to talk to a real person. And I said, that's wonderful. Do you think that the signal coming over a telephone wire, the simulation in digital form of what began its life as an analog signal somewhere else in the world that recreates a facsimile or simulation of a human voice, do you really think that's a real person that when you turn this thing on is coming out of this little speaker? No real little person in here. No little person. It's a device like the ones you make for transforming the information into a form which human beings immediately begin to mistake as a real person. And nobody knows when the technology first emerges how it is to be used, what good it is for. We always use a new technology like the old technologies. A word processor is just a typewriter, a fancy typewriter, until you discover that it's not at all. It discloses all sorts of other possibilities for creation. So when Graham Bell was asked what he might do with the telephone, he said, and I quote, "Perhaps you could allow another town to know that a telegram is on its way." Right? Now, the point is, here's the man who invented it. But that doesn't matter because he didn't see the social uses or implications of the technology. He was formed by telegraphy. Telegraphy was really the start of all this. This electronic communication thing is a 200-year cycle. Speech, writing, printing press, electronic communications. Those are the four great transformative areas of the word. It began with larynx, pharynx, throat, and brain co-evolving in order to create this virtual space, by which I mean, I guess you didn't see it when I said it, this virtual space that is created by speaker and listener, by our brains and by our anatomy, that is a recent emergent biological construction. This is the first virtual space. It's not real. It's how we construct reality and share it and reinforce it. And then writing transformed it, and the printing press transformed it again, and electronic communication is transforming it again. The telegraph was the first time our information moved significantly faster than we could move, and that was the revolution. So what did it take for telephones to become so commonplace that we all carry these things and don't think anything of it and think we're talking to a real person instead of when we get an email? Now you know it's an email from a real person that has socialized us already. It takes the technology transforming us over time in that symbiotic relationship I described according to Minsky, that changes us into the kinds of beings who can use the technology. And therefore, the cutting edge for you is to identify where people are willing and capable to be led into what is emerging as it emerges so they can adopt the new technology when it is ready for market, both internal market, all of you who use the IT technology, and the external market, the extraordinary devices you make that saved my son's life. So of course Bell didn't know what it was good for. When I grew up, I used to call a grocery store and say, deliver bread, deliver meat, deliver so on, and they'd deliver it. I used the telephone to order food. But if you'd said to Graham Bell, well, you know what, you could develop a telephone grocery, and people could call up on the telephone, except they didn't have the word call up, and get food. And it never would have worked because the distribution of the technology through the society had not yet changed us enough to do that. But when I called a store and ordered food, I didn't think anything of it. I was at DEF CON when the Webvan guys all got their pink email, 30 or 40 of them at the same time. Webvan was one of the first big online groceries, burned through umpteen millions of dollars, and went out of business. And they all went out of business, of course, at the same time. It's like this change we talk about. Somebody asked Hemingway, Ernest, how do you go bankrupt? He said 2 ways, gradually and suddenly. Well, that's how you go out of business. Gradually and suddenly. It had been happening gradually. They hadn't quite seen it, but then it happened suddenly, and everybody got it. What was the problem with Webvan? They were ahead of the social curve, not the technology curve. People didn't know how to use the web to order groceries yet. They had to be socialized by the network, and now that we have been, web ordering for groceries is coming back because the web itself has taught us how to use it, and it's not a big thing, it's a small thing. It's a subset of web life that everybody lives. So that tells us how you have to keep an eye on what's emerging. Okay, are you up for this? I guess that's the question I want to ask. Are you up for this? I think your brains are much more plastic than you imagine. The wonderful discoveries we are now making about the neural net that is our brain is that it is capable of learning new things at any time in spades. They did some wonderful studies with Braille, where people at any age, once they start learning Braille, began developing many, many millions more neurons in the part of the brain that is sensitive to the touch of the finger. The plasticity of the brain, once the human intention is clear, is extraordinary. You see this more in extreme conditions. Jerry Coffey is a guy I know who spent more time than anybody else in Hanoi Hilton, over 7 years in that hellhole. And one of his cohorts loved golf. And in his mind, he played the same golf course every day, 18 holes. Different game every day, but in his mind, he sat there in the dark, often being tortured and brutalized and in great pain, unable to talk to anybody else except through a tapping system they worked out in the cells. And he played that golf course over and over and over again in his mind. And when he got out, he'd knocked, I think, 10 or 12 strokes off his game. So whatever it is you practice is what you wind up internalizing deeply and doing. This is the way a friend of mine put it. He studied karate. He got so good at it, spent so much time in the dojo, he didn't even have to think about it. And one day when he left the movie theater and was walking around the corner to his car at midnight, a hand came out of the darkness and grabbed him by the shoulder. And without even thinking, he turned and broke his assailant's neck. Except it wasn't an assailant. It was a friend trying to say, hey, how are you doing? And he said, I learned an important lesson from that. Whatever it is you practice, make sure that's what you want to do. Because when you don't have time to think, what you are going to wind up doing is what you have been practicing. And therefore, what we're talking about is a self-conscious, intentional choice of the kinds of skills and knowledge you need to be alert to new patterns emerging, and collectively in groups to identify them and not throw them out of the room yet because they sound so foolish, because they don't match the patterns of the past, because they're not literally thinkable. Okay? So where do you go to see what's emerging on the edges? Well, I like to go to 3 places. See if I can find it here. Oh, I have so much to say, and it's so important. I just love it. And I guess that's an example of what you have to do, which I was saying to one of you before. What do you have to do? Never sleep. Put yourself in a place of learning. Make sure you're one of the dumbest people in the room all the time, so that you're constantly tilting the pattern so the information and knowledge and wisdom flows down to you, so that you keep growing, because you have to learn how to learn. The technology has demanded that we learn how to learn. You know, one of my sons was an example of that. He created at Northwestern years ago an ad hoc major. He wanted to learn symbolic systems studies, he called it. We don't have that, they said. So he took courses from math, cognitive psych, computer science, artificial intelligence, combined them, integrated them in a platform, made it a major. And when he graduated with all those hundreds of people, everybody got a degree in English and a degree in this, and he got up and they said, and we have one ad hoc major. And everybody laughed. Okay? Because he was the edge of the future. That's why they laughed. Now everybody knows, quote unquote, that you have to be learning constantly and in a cross-disciplinary way so that you are constantly in an immersive environment being challenged to grow and change what you think. There are no categories of thinking anymore. The boundaries around those have gone too. So where are these things emerging on the edges that we can see them first? Thank you. He tells me I have 5 minutes. Well, the 3 places I like to go are these. I like to see what kids are playing with. That's why I went to the hackers. I pretended to have something of value to say. They said, you do have something of value. You're wise and you respect us and you take us seriously. I got one of the greatest emails I've ever gotten after speaking at DEF CON for the 8th year this summer. One of the guys wrote, we can't tell you how much it means that you come and speak to us every year. You're like our hacker dad. You know? And there are certain things you stick aside as true trophies, and that email is one. Because what he got is that I love them. I value their unconventional thinking, their willingness to cross boundaries, their willingness to refuse to take anything for granted, their inability to have somebody tell them you can't do it that way. They ask of the system not what was it designed to do, but what is it capable of doing? What can I make it do? And in order to know that, you have to get down into the system and figure it out. So I go to the kids who are so smart. I learned that with my 12-year-old when I bought him an Apple II. He took it out of the box, started programming, and was off and running. It took me 2 years before I got into this. I was a text guy. I taught literature. I wrote. I read. I knew how text works, but I didn't know how the computer worked. And finally, I realized if I was kind to him, gentle, loving, and patient, perhaps my 12-year-old would teach me what I needed to know in order to move forward into the generation that he was becoming part of. So you go to the kids. Well, what are the kids studying today? It sounds crazy. I was standing next to the museum shop in Milwaukee the other day waiting to get in the IMAX, and I looked and saw these words on the glass plate window of the museum. This is what they're selling to the kids. Listen closely. Off-world gear, weapons for the mind, cyber pets, idea generators, cosmic debris, alien life forms, space armor, space junk, and thought reactors. I'm not kidding. Robots are now a part of everybody's life because they integrated them with Legos. But way back when he was first designing the Lisp, the logo program from Lisp, and you could learn how to do a robot, it was only the pioneers who figured that out, but now you can buy it in any children's store. Build your own robot. Look at what the children are playing with. When Sony came up with the first PlayStation, what did the engineers who devised it do? They gave it to a bunch of 12-year-olds and then stood behind one-way glass and watched what they did with it in order to learn how the children, like the hackers, invented new ways of using it that they themselves who had designed it had not even thought about. Go to the kids. The kids will teach you what is coming, as crazy as it sounds. I go to war. I go to the military. Everything that has emerged in the corporate space, damn near everything, has come out of those government contracts that began when Eisenhower warned us that something new was being built. 1960, he said, watch out for the military, industrial, and its extended entertainment, media, educational complex. In other words, a singular, self-directed unity was being created, which was going to determine research. And what determines research determines, like any paradigm, the questions that you are capable of asking. If you determine the questions that people can ask, you don't have to worry about the answers. They're presupposed and they're in there, embedded. So this whole military, industrial, entertainment, education complex in which we now live is 10, 20, 30 years ahead. It's why I like to go there. I've explored UFOs for 20, 30 years. Most of the time, it's my friends doing tricky things. Once in a while, it's not. Once in a while, it's an anomalous vehicle dancing rings around our greatest capabilities and leaving our best fighter pilots in the dust. Okay, you see what happened there? See, I did that intentionally. This is just a ploy. I wanted to show you what it's like when someone who has established credibility tells you something that you literally cannot believe. You literally can't believe that they're real, right? Alien life forms, off-world gear. Don't you see where the edge is? If you ask somebody in England where the center of the world was 200 years ago, they'd say it's right here, Bank of England, corner of the city. And you say, well, what about the colonies? Oh, they're way out on the edge. But anyone with vision saw that the American century was on its move already, and that edge was the new center, and that we have had our time and maybe have a little time left. The edge has become the new center. The center is right here in America for now. Well, actually it was. It's not now, because by the time someone can say the truth about it, it's over. Where is the edge now? It's there. Transplanetary culture is what I told the hackers to prepare themselves for. Life on the moon, life on Mars. Don't you know what they're working on? I mean, go and look at what the military is working on. Faster than light, anti-gravity, all the UFO technologies, lasers, all the things we have imagined are going to be necessary for true transplanetary and transgalactic transportation, teleportation. It's not science fiction. Science fiction is how a technological society dreams. And that's getting smaller and smaller, the dream and the reality. Jules Verne, Earth to the Moon, 1869. 1969, 100 years later, we were there. Brave New World, social conditioning and genetic engineering, 1930s, 1990s, we were there. Neuromancer, cyberspace, cyborg humanity, early 1980s, 1990s, we are there. The gap between dream and reality has gotten smaller and smaller. Look as best you can at what the military is developing. You know what soldiers are using and needing. You know what the medical technologies are doing in the field. Not only network-centric warfare, which is embedding everything in everybody, that is going to make telepathy and clairvoyance indistinguishable from what our technologies enable us to do when the wireless technology is a chip in us, and we can broadcast interconnectedly, and RFIDs and the like are in all implements. What is the difference between telepathy and clairvoyance? When objects can talk to each other, we can talk to each other, and we can all talk to one another, objects and people. We are replicating at a higher level of abstraction the phenomenal unity that already exists in the universe as it is described by contemporary physics. So go to the military, see what they're working on. 3, sex sites. Okay? Why? Because what do people love, right? Food, drugs, gambling, sex, right? What are the big industries that first came up on the internet except for food? Gambling, sex, drugs. How are drugs used? Take a look at the cartels and the narco-terrorists and the funders of terrorists and how they finance their networks and how they use the technology in the most advanced ways. Why? Because they have the money to do it and do the R&D. I interviewed a sleazeball who came up with a website called clublove.com. Has anybody ever been there? You know, never. I always ask, nobody has ever gone to clublove.com. 1 million, 2 million, 3 million hits a day, but in my audiences, never has anybody been there. Seth Warshawski was his name. And he was telling me several years ago when I interviewed him, he says, it's not about the junk we produce. And he came up with some disgusting stuff. It's about delivering the platform. I want to develop the platform because then I'll get a piece of whatever people are going to deliver, because sex itself is a commodity and is going to rapidly become a commodity. It was still then in the process of being socialized, people believing that what they saw on the screen was real, the digital simulation. So I'm not saying that you should go to the sex sites. I'm saying you should look at where the R&D money flows, because that's where people are using it to advance the platform as quickly as humanly possible. Okay, that's about it. Boy. All right, what we're talking about is leadership. Let me conclude with a couple of things. We're talking about leadership, and this is what I mean by leadership. And this is true for you in any work group, in any situation, in any environment. Same guy who did the karate, did whitewater kayaking. And he said, you know, I've learned something really critical about when you're coming up to the rapids and the rocks. He said, if you look at the rocks, you always hit the rocks. But if you look at where the water goes, you always go where the water goes. I think that's the best definition of leadership I have ever heard. The ability to see clearly what is emerging on the edges of the new space which we inhabit. And the ability to say it so that everybody kind of gets, whether you have hierarchical authority or not, but everybody gets that it's right. Like Gloria Steinem was right. The ripening is all. If you have the ability to see what's coming and clearly say it, communication skills, in a way that the business enterprise, business acumen, can then integrate into its processes, then you are functionally a leader. It is not always necessarily recognized. You will not always get a badge or stock options. But you will see people just suddenly kind of coalesce and go where the water goes, and the flow will take you exactly where you need to go. It is not easy. Machiavelli said when the printing press was invented, the Renaissance was one of its consequences. It ought to be remembered there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, nothing more perilous to conduct, nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. You did not ask to be leaders, you asked to just have a great play space. But with the play space came leadership. You build the infrastructure which molds the minds, behaviors, thoughts, everything of the cyborg humanity that we are becoming. And that is why when I walked into ICU a week ago, you saved my son's life. Don't forget the enormity of what you do in the hurry-up, compressed pressure of the work environment. You are saving our lives. And I think I'm probably speaking for how many millions of people when I tell you that we are genuinely grateful. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Break time question? A question? You're the boss.
Now, why don't you talk to him afterwards?
Okay, I'll be out here for a little bit before I go on to the next thing. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with you.
We've got a 10-minute break now, but first I have to ask, just like any time, we have a little interruption. Who here has been involved in a BAFA activity before? Can you show your hands? Okay, can you talk to, it'll be tomorrow's activity. So, Richard, where are you standing here somewhere, I hope? Richard Gillen? Great. Anyway, before lunch, could you try and find Richard Gillen? He'll be just outside the doors. If you've done BAFA before, he'd like to talk to you just before lunch or during lunch. Thanks. Okay, let's use the clock up here at 10 o'clock. Start back up again.